I'm going to share my slides here and get us into the conversation. And then when I get to the end of my part, probably at about 5:40 or thereabouts, I will come back out to me to see you, to let you see me as we have that question and answer part of the conversation. The 21st century. All right. So hopefully you all are now seeing my slideshow. I got a brand new laptop that is ridiculously sensitive. So if things accidentally happen, it's only because my fingers are not cooperating with what I want to say. But hopefully you're all seeing this slideshow. And so to start out, I wanted to just share the two kind of main ideas, the two main propositions that I'm talking about in this talk, although it's really the second one that I'm going to be focused on in the body of my talk more fully. But the first one is very much the origin point, the kind of starting point for why I'm thinking about and talking about these things, and where that conversation with Lori that she mentioned began. And that first one is a little more negative. It's a little more critical. I think it's an important critical perspective, but it certainly is a little more of that. And the second one is more optimistic. It's more positive. It's more forward-looking. And anybody who knows me knows that my focus tends to try to be on those more optimistic threads in these conversations. So that's partly why I wanted to dwell in it at greater length today. It's also more about the text and the topic that I think we need to add, that I want to highlight more fully. But again, the first one is the starting point. And so just a little bit on that first one, but then especially today more on the second. Be happy to talk about all these things as we go. And they are about this duality, this pair of texts. Mainly, I suppose, the novels, although the film adaptations of both of them are very faithful adaptations of these two novels. And so when I'm talking about them, I'm really talking about both the novel and the film, in each case in a lot of ways. And that is Harper Lee's 1960 novel To Kill a Mockingbird, which was made into Academy Award-winning, very prominent film in 1962. And then Gordon Parks' autobiographical novel, The Learning Tree, from 1963, which...
Sorry, Ben, I think you're off presentation mode for some reason.
Oh, okay. That's annoying. All right, hold on one sec. Thank you for telling me that. Seeing the slides now, Lori?
Yep, we're good.
All right, sorry about that. 2021 be like. Okay, so Gordon Parks' 1963 autobiographical novel, The Learning Tree, made into a film, written and directed by Parks himself in 1969. So I'm talking about both of these texts, but again, I'm going to be focusing more on The Learning Tree, but the starting point is also very much about To Kill a Mockingbird. So just to highlight those two propositions, those two starting points, and then the second will be the one that I will delve into more fully. So the first one, the more critical proposition, is that To Kill a Mockingbird is overrepresented, overused, overemphasized in both our classrooms and our collective conversations. And that's not just about the overuse of it, which I'll kind of quickly try to just highlight, but more about the way that this text is engaged and presented. And then the second idea is that The Learning Tree can offer not just then an addition to the conversations, but a text that can in many ways do the things that we're asking To Kill a Mockingbird to do, but do them more fully, more interestingly, more meaningfully, more collectively, more successfully, I would argue. So in terms of the overuse, I don't want to dwell on it, but I think it's fair to say, and I've seen various studies to this effect, that To Kill a Mockingbird remains now and has been for decades one of the most consistently taught texts in American classrooms, for example, and also appears all over the place on lists of greatest American novels, most famous American novels, texts all Americans should read, all those kinds of conversations. In my own anecdotal experience, I've seen it used again and again in classrooms. I read it in, I believe, 9th grade in the late 1980s. My sister read it in, I believe, middle school in the 1990s. I've known multiple students talk about encountering it in middle and high school throughout the 2000s. And my oldest son just read it in 9th grade about a month ago. So over the last at least 35 years, I've seen multiple instances of this novel being taught. But again, more broadly, it seems to be one of the most consistently taught and consistently featured American novels, certainly of the last century, but really of all time in a lot of ways. And again, that's not in and of itself an issue necessarily, but what I do find an issue, what is more the point of my critique here, is the way that it's taught and the way that it's used, which is as a really exemplary engagement with a set of key American themes and histories and questions. Themes around race and racism and prejudice, themes around the histories of the Jim Crow South and segregation and discrimination, themes of being a bystander or standing up in the face of those kinds of histories and in the face of injustices and a movement toward justice or equality, the challenges of it. All of those kinds of themes are central ones through which To Kill a Mockingbird is often presented and taught and engaged and talked about. And I think that's a little unfair even to Kill a Mockingbird, because I don't think that Harper Lee actually intended those to be central focal points. I think her intent, from everything that I've seen and read and understood, was to see this as a coming of age story. And I'll talk more about that side of it in a few minutes, because The Learning Tree is that as well, of a young girl growing up in the 1930s in Alabama. And with the themes of race and racism and justice and injustice as a kind of secondary thread in terms of what that young girl, Scout Finch, encounters, and specifically what her dad, the lawyer Atticus Finch, encounters. I don't think she intended her book to be centrally about those themes. They are a kind of minor note in the overture of Scout's young life. But it has become the way that the novel is so frequently taught and talked about and read and discussed. And as a result, I think way too much weight is placed on it, particularly through those lenses. And so the second part of my talk today, or the second point of my talk, but the main focus of my talk, is on another text, another story that could do all those things much better, while at the same time doing many of the things that we now turn to, or could turn to To Kill a Mockingbird for: a coming of age story, a story about childhood, about growth, about the relationship of a child to society and culture, both specifically in the early 20th century in America and more broadly or universally. I think The Learning Tree has a lot to offer in all of those ways, but that it especially offers a great deal more when it comes to these central themes and questions through which To Kill a Mockingbird is so often taught and talked about. And so again, the origin point was more my frustration with the way that I think To Kill a Mockingbird is overrepresented in these conversations, educationally and collectively. But the centerpiece of my talk today is suggesting an alternative, or at least an addition. But at the end of the day, there are choices to be made. There are choices in classrooms, choices in curricula, choices in a lot of different layers of our conversations. And my argument here would be that The Learning Tree would be a choice we should be making a lot more fully and a lot more consistently than it ever has been, and perhaps than To Kill a Mockingbird is now. And then the last kind of starting point premise that I'll briefly note before I get into the specifics for a few is about these two authors and artists as well. And again, I really don't mean this to be a critique of Lee, who wrote a really stunning book. Her only published novel in most of her lifetime is quite an achievement. It's quite an impressive book, and I don't mean to denigrate it. But it's a striking thing to me, and it is related to this overemphasis on To Kill a Mockingbird, and I'll be blunt, to the way racism and white supremacy can function in ignoring or minimizing other artists. That Lee and her book are so much better known than the man on the right of my screen, I assume you're seeing it in the same way, Gordon Parks. Because again, Lee wrote one book for the majority of her life, a really interesting, successful book, but one book, and then largely disappeared from the public eye for decades and decades. And that perhaps made her more interesting, but it also meant that this was the one particular thing connected to her that we had to highlight or engage. Gordon Parks is the opposite. For almost a century, from the 1930s through the early 2000s, he was a true Renaissance American who achieved profound, influential, meaningful success in a really wide range of artistic and cultural and social spheres. Centrally as a photographer, he's one of the most important American photographers in our history, from his very early work with the Farm Security Administration during the Depression and the beginning of World War II, through his really pioneering work with African-American subjects, his pioneering journalistic work for Life magazine, and a variety of other photographic achievements and pursuits. But that's also just the tip of the iceberg with Parks. During those same years, and certainly in the second half of his life, he also turned to a variety of other pursuits with real success and meaning. He was a musician and composer. I mentioned that he wrote the music for The Learning Tree. He was a poet. He was a novelist. He wrote this autobiographical novel, The Learning Tree. He wrote a 3-volume memoir. He co-founded Essence magazine, the really important African-American Lifestyle and Culture and Artistic magazine that remains a key journalistic text into the 21st century. In a variety of ways. He was a really influential filmmaker. He directed not only The Learning Tree, based on his own book, for which he was the first African-American director for a major Hollywood studio, but he also directed the first Shaft film, considered a real complicated, important, pioneering example of that 1970s genre of blaxploitation action films, or blaxploitation films in general. Just a pioneering artist and figure and life in many different arenas of 20th century American life and culture and society into the 21st as well. And it's stunning to me that he's not significantly better known, and certainly that he doesn't have the kind of place in our collective memories that an artist like Lee does, or that so many other artists, much of the time white artists do. And so that's also part of the starting point here, is just better remembering a figure, better remembering his life and work and achievements. But it's not my focus. My focus is on this particular text, and specifically the novel, although the film adaptation is very, very faithful to the novel. So what I'm talking about here works for both of them, and they can be used in conversation, just as To Kill a Mockingbird novel and film are often used in conversation. And so my premise here, my thesis for the second part, the why the learning tree part, is that it offers a more messy, more real, and more American coming of age story for all American audiences than does To Kill a Mockingbird, and then do many of the texts that we often teach or feature. And I'm going to make that case through four specific topics, these four topics that you see here, for just a couple minutes each, and then come back out to a final thought or two, and then stop what is now, I hope, the successful sharing in order to keep the conversation going with you all for a bit. So first of all, that first topic, and that central way that I think we would define both of these texts as coming of age stories, as stories about childhood and an individual's progress through some significant stages and moments in childhood. Now, I think To Kill a Mockingbird is quite successful at that, as I had mentioned before. I think that Lee does a great job creating the voice and identity and perspective of her young child narrator and protagonist Scout, of her brother Jem, of multiple characters that we encounter through her lens. But even on this terms, even viewed through this particular lens, I think The Learning Tree has things to offer through a couple of different layers that are beyond what To Kill a Mockingbird includes, and that make it at least as successful as this thing that they both kind of are, before we then get into the other things that Learning Tree really decisively, I think, adds to the mix. For example, just in terms of the choice of age that each author makes, Scout is very young in the 3 years or so that To Kill a Mockingbird spans. She begins at about 6, and by the end of the novel, she's about 9. And as a result of that, there's nothing obviously wrong with that. It's an important stage, as any stage of childhood is, and it covers multiple stages, in fact. But as a result of that youth, what we really see with Scout in a lot of ways in To Kill a Mockingbird is her observing and experiencing things in the world that often she's not quite herself yet able to understand or process. She can do so sort of from the present vantage point looking back in the novel, but that she is more at times a passive observer or experiencer of as they happen around her, happen to her father, happen to Tom Robinson, the character I'll come back to in a few, the falsely accused African-American man, happy to Boo Radley, her complicated outcast neighbor, who I'll come back to as well. Because of her youth and because of the time in her childhood that the novel is set, she is often more of an observer and more passive in terms of those things. On the other hand, Gordon Parks sets his novel in one year, a really pivotal year, the year between 12 and 13, for his youthful protagonist, Newt Winger, in the Oklahoma world in which he's growing up, and more on that in a second. And because of that choice, and then because of what happens in that particular year that Parks writes about, and then that is the focus of the film, a great deal more happens to Newt, first of all, and also he's able to be a more active, thoughtful, engaged participant in and is affected more deeply by, I would argue, those events because of his more deep connection to them as a result of his older age and a result of some of the things that Parks chooses to include. The novels have many similar typical and atypical events, as I note, friendship dynamics, family dynamics, moments of death and violence. But Newt's story includes more signal sort of turning points in this one year. For example, his first sexual encounter, his first real deep romantic connection, threats against himself as a person rather than simply external ones, a more direct personal experience, both himself and that of friends and family with the justice system, the legal system, a variety of events that we see somewhat from afar at times in To Kill a Mockingbird that Newt experiences more firsthand, and then some again that he experiences more firsthand because of his age, like these first experiences with sex and romance, among other things, making this truly a coming of age story on a variety of significant levels that, say, middle school and high school audiences can connect to perhaps a little more fully than the more youthful experiences of 6 to 9-year-old Scout. And again, Newt is also more active in his engagement with them, more consistently active, not only because of his age, but just because of the particular events that Parks highlights. Again, many of the events of To Kill a Mockingbird happen around Scout, and she observes them and reflects on them in really interesting ways. But Newt is directly involved in virtually all of the main events that happen in the Learning Tree. And so he not only has more of a role to play, but it leads him to make some really complicated, significant choices. Certainly by the end of the book, there's one long final section that I won't spoil at length here, in which he is faced with a really crucial choice, a choice that is very much about questions of coming of age and maturity and his relationship to the world. And the choice that he makes is significant and influential and has pluses and minuses. It's a really complicated coming of age conclusion. Whereas if you know the conclusion of To Kill a Mockingbird, huge things happen involving Scout, but she is again largely the passive victim and affected person because of her age and experiences. And so in that way as well, the Learning Tree is more of, I would argue, a full coming of age story presenting its protagonist ultimately with these really significant choices and actions that he has to consider and make. And then finally, race also does play into this, and I'll get more to this in a second. Newt, like most of the main characters of the Learning Tree, is African-American, and so for him, childhood is always fraught. By the end of To Kill a Mockingbird, Scout experiences a moment of real violence, a shocking and striking one. But that is precisely shocking and striking because it's so unexpected and abnormal for a 9-year-old girl, a 9-year-old white girl anyway. But for Newt, even things that might seem to be pure childhood pleasures in the book and film inexorably connect to racism and the potential threats at all times that Newt and his friends face as young African-American men. In their early 20th century Oklahoma world. It's set in the kind of 1910s. And that includes, for example, an opening scene where they're simply playing in the river, swimming together, that then turns into a moment of violence that they are directly connected to. And then later, the circus comes to town, and we see, again, a really complicated, striking sequence in which Newt and his friends are pulled into that world in an unexpected way, but ultimately a way that has a lot to do with their race and their identity. So even the things that we might see as just childhood coming of age moments have another layer, another side for Newt and the novel, while still having that feel of childhood pleasures at times too. There's a real nostalgia in the portrait that the book and film present, because this was the world in which Gordon Parks grew up, like how Harper Lee presents her childhood world. But that childhood nostalgia and those more typical coming of age experiences, perhaps, which the Learning Tree really highlights at length, also have this additional layer always that adds a lot to that text and the way that it engages those themes. And so then the second, third, and fourth categories I'm highlighting are even more fully present in the Learning Tree in ways that they are not quite as fully present in To Kill a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird.
Ben, I'm so sorry. I just want to let you know, I'm not sure if your slides are advancing. We're still seeing the initial slide with the two covers. I didn't know if you had already advanced them.
Yeah, they are advancing. Okay.
So sorry.
That's okay. It must be my new computer here. I don't know why. What about now? Are you seeing anything different?
It actually isn't presenting. Like, it just jumped right off of the presentation.
Cool. How about now? What do you see on the screen now?
Just you.
Cool. All right.
I'm so sorry.
Hey, you know
New
what?
technology is fun.
Thank you for telling me. Let me try one more time to present and see if this will work in this way. Okay, so sorry about that. These were the topics. When I said there were 4 topics, these were the topics: coming of age stories, racial realities, American communities, expanding audiences. This was the one I was just talking about, those coming of age stories, Scout's younger age, Newt's older, and some of these different layers of Newt's coming of age story in particular. And this is the topic to which I now turn, and hopefully which we can all see together, which is the way in which the social world of the Learning Tree foregrounds racial realities, particularly for this slide's purposes, around issues of law, justice, insiders and outsiders to society, in a way that are hinted at or somewhat present in To Kill a Mockingbird, but much more deep and multi-layered in the Learning Tree. So the 2 most famous supporting characters in To Kill a Mockingbird, I would argue, are Tom Robinson and Boo Radley. Tom Robinson is the African-American man falsely accused of rape who ends up being convicted and, spoiler alert for an old, very famous text, killed in prison as he tries to escape, allegedly. And then Boo Radley is the very complicated, outcast, never seen neighbor of Scout and her family who ends up being not what he seems and playing a really important and heroic role toward the end of the book that defies the idea of him as an outcast. A couple of characters who certainly have things to teach Scout and the novel's readers about race and justice, about perceptions and realities, outcasts and their real identities, and so on. But the learning tree, through just the world that it includes and through the choices of how Parks develops it, is able to present much more multi-layered versions of some of those same themes and some interconnected issues that go well beyond what these more brief supporting roles and characters in Scout's story and To Kill a Mockingbird can do. So just quickly on each of those. Again, Tom Robinson's story really centrally connects to the idea of the legal system, the justice system, and the vision of particular African Americans as criminals within that world. But because Parks presents a multi-character, multi-layered African American world in the learning tree, he can at much greater length present those themes, both through a friend of Newt's, one of his peers, named Gus, and through Gus's father, Marcus. I think I may have those names backward. I think Marcus is the kid and Gus is the father. Either way, through that father-son dynamic, we see at much greater length and with much more complexity and depth how African-American men can be implicated by, connected to, drawn into the systems of the legal system, the justice system, the world of prison and its aftermaths, the effects on them, the complicated relationship they then have to their larger society, both African-American society and the town overall. These themes are threaded through those two characters at much greater length, from the beginning of the story to the end, than in the somewhat more brief and outsider view that we get of Tom Robinson and his trial and his life and death. Secondly, a second way in which these racial realities are more multi-layered has to do with rape. As you probably know, Tom Robinson's, the crime of which he's accused is raping a white woman falsely. He did not do so. It's largely her racist father's influence that leads to this accusation. But that, even though that is a false accusation, that still certainly plays into one of the most dominant tropes and images of American culture and society throughout our history, and certainly of the South between the Civil War and the 1960s, if not beyond, which are images and tropes and narratives of African-American rapists, Black men raping or potentially raping or threatening with rape or being envisioned as rapists of white women, all of which was true. It was a dominant trend, a dominant trope, a dominant propagandistic myth about African-American men, about the South throughout this period. But there's no question that the truth of how rape has functioned in the world of race in America is not only not that propagandistic myth, but it's the exact opposite. By far the most consistent acts of sexual violence in American history were of African-American women by white men. That happened throughout the practice of slavery, for example, throughout its time and those histories of the United States, white male slave owners raping female enslaved people. And that threat and that reality continued very much into the post-Civil War South, where white sons of privilege could still and did still, by all historical accounts, continue to threaten and actually sexually violate African-American women. With a very little consequence, if any, ever consequence. And that is a plot thread that Parks is able to include. In this novel, the rape story is completely separate from these African-American criminals, and it involves a young woman who is Newt's first love, his first girlfriend, R.C. Jefferson, who is eventually tragically raped by a young white son of privilege, one of the most privileged young white men in the town, and impregnated by him in a way that basically destroys her and her family's life. A plot thread that very differently frames these issues of rape and race than even the false accusations that To Kill a Mockingbird includes. So again, this multi-layered nature allows Parks to go in a very different and ultimately more historically and culturally, I would say, challenging and meaningful way with these themes of sexual violence and race. And then even with Boo Radley and this character of the outcast. And Boo is an interesting character, if almost entirely unseen until the very end of the book. But again, if we think about, say, the father of this friend of Newt's, and I believe Marcus is the father. Marcus, who is himself this kind of social outcast, this complicated figure within the African-American community and within the larger town because of his own histories, because of his ongoing identity, because of his son's identity eventually. And that allows that outcast character to be one we see from beginning to end, We see in multi-layered relationship to multiple communities in town. We get to see at least a little bit of the home life of him and his son in ways that opens up a different side of thinking about them. All layers to those outcasts, that outcast character especially, beyond what someone like Boo Radley is able to include. Not least because of the narration of the novel. It's not first person like To Kill a Mockingbird, so Parks can move toward other characters in fuller ways than Lee does with her first-person narration of Scout. So all those themes that Tom and Boo do certainly connect to are present in the learning tree, but present on multiple layers of community, of identity, of individual stories, of the larger fabric of the book that add a lot to these themes of justice, of the concept of criminality, of rape and race, of the outcast relationship to society, and of more. Thirdly, the third topic that connects to a lot of these is just the way in which the American community presented in the learning tree is so much more genuinely diverse and rich than the American community we get to see at length in To Kill a Mockingbird. And the main reason for that is that in the learning tree, we get to see a wide range of African-American characters within this Oklahoma community where the novel is set in the 19-teens. If you know To Kill a Mockingbird, we mainly have Tom, very briefly, his wife and later widow, and then the African-American woman who works as a servant / family member, but officially servant for Scout, her father, and her brother, Calpurnia. And we see them at some length, but we see them very much as individuals without much of a context of the larger worlds that they are part of. Particularly, we see them in relationship to Scout and then to Atticus, her father, through Scout's perspective. In the learning tree, we get a truly multi-generational, multifaceted, multi-layered African-American world, one that includes multiple settings, multiple families, social settings, business settings, a variety of experiences and perspectives. That includes peers for Newt, a handful of different young African-American men, including the one that I've mentioned who ends up in the justice system, but many others as well. It includes multiple generations of his own family, his older brother, his sister, his mother and father, a blind uncle who plays an interesting and important role, just a truly multi-layered examination of an African-American world, and thus of another layer within an American world in that early 19-teens Oklahoma setting, which includes both the African-American community on those multiple layers at length, includes multiple glimpses within the variety, as well as some of the more shared prejudices of the white community. We certainly see more progressive white figures, more conservative ones in conversation and contrast with each other and in relationship to African-American characters like Newt, but not limited to him, in a way that goes beyond, let's say, just Atticus's role in To Kill a Mockingbird as one interesting, seemingly progressive white lawyer in this Jim Crow Southern town. Here we see multiple voices, both of progress, of prejudice, and of the long range in between, even within the same family at times. So there's a pretty progressive white judge, but his son is the son of privilege who rapes young Arcella, Newt's love. And so that Kavanaugh family, Judge Kavanaugh, and then his son of privilege represent multiple layers within the spectrum, even within one family. And then again, we see a great deal of variety within the white community, just as within the African-American, but ultimately very much between them in all the complicated interrelationships from the worst to the best, to the whole range in between in particular, that communities like this featured. It allows this novel and film adaptation to present an American community through these layers of not just race and racism, but of multiple gradations around generations and class and work and insider-outsider dynamics and more, gender for sure, that are simply beyond what we can get through To Kill a Mockingbird's more limited lens. And it makes this book a really rich portrayal, and the film adaptation a really rich portrayal of an American community and of lots of potential American communities to which it might be connected. And that's the last topic I wanted to come to for a couple, is the slightly broader idea of what it means to expand our stories and what that can mean for audiences, and what I meant at the start by all American audiences. Since you weren't seeing the slide, I'll briefly get you back to that thesis of mine, a more messy, more real, and more American coming-of-age story for all American audiences. I've tried to talk about some of the first few topics a little bit across these slides, so this all American audiences is a bit where I'm concluding here. But first of all, before getting to that, it's worth saying again, both of these texts occupy multiple interesting genres, literary ones, artistic ones, cultural ones. They're both historical novels set sometime before their present or the moment of their publication. They're both very much local color representations of particular worlds, Alabama and Mockingbird, Oklahoma Oklahoma in the Learning Tree. They're both, again, Bildungsroman, stories of the growth of a young person, a kind of coming of age story, or at least evolution and change for a young child protagonist. But in all those ways, in all those genres, I would argue, still into the 21st century, when we think about them, when we talk about them, when we teach them, our starting points are white texts, white authored texts, texts with white characters at their center, even if, like in the case of Tom Robinson, they have supporting African-American ones. In which case, we then leave something like African-American literature as its own separate genre to be presented or talked about, but not necessarily how we define these central, ongoing other literary genres. Our starting points, our defaults, I would argue, are very consistently white in their authorship, in their content, in what they present. And so the Learning Tree is a great example of just how false that dichotomy is, that a work that is certainly a work of African-American literature and art is also a really exemplary, interesting example of these other genres. And it would allow a teacher, a classroom, a conversation to think about how a text presents the past, how it presents a place in a local world, how it presents these themes of coming of age, while also layering in multiple diverse American communities and identities beyond the white ones that still serve as such a default so much of the time. And so in terms of what that can mean for audience, it can mean multiple things. Certainly for any students, readers, viewers, et cetera, of color, it offers that so meaningful example of representation. And of representation, again, in places we might not expect it. I think a lot of the time, the way our curricula now work is that we might have a series of texts and then perhaps an example of a diverse text. But what would it mean to replace much of the series with texts by authors or featuring worlds of color as well? What would it mean to replace To Kill a Mockingbird with The Learning Tree and still do many of those things that those other genres represent and those themes of justice and injustice and standing up and so on, while also featuring at the heart characters, worlds, stories of color. And that question of representation is a key part of that. But of course, equally important, if not more so, would be for white students and audiences in classrooms and out of classrooms. Not just, again, the opportunity to read and connect to communities and cultures that are a part of an American identity and experience equally, but also and especially to do so in a consistent way, in a central way, not as one text at one moment in a curriculum, but as a consistent series of texts that ask white students and readers and audiences to decenter themselves, to decenter their own location and encounter other stories and experiences that may feel very similar in some ways to their own and may feel very different. It's obviously a spectrum in every case, but that open up all those possibilities. And so for all audiences, for all students, for all classrooms, for all conversations, I think adding a text like The Learning Tree in a central place has a lot of work it can do. And then even more broadly than that still, this broader idea from my talk's title, expanding our American stories. Our stories, to go back to what I said about the genres at the top here, but to say it about American stories as well. Consistently, I would argue the default still in so much of our collective conversation and collective memory for stories of childhood, for stories of community, for the visions of history that we share are white at their center. And then perhaps we layer in what we consider diverse additions to those defaults, the representations of race and culture and ethnicity and heritage and community. But at the end of the day, that's been a choice, and it's been a choice of the canon, of curricula, of our dominant power structures, of things like our systems of cultural production, and just of the way our conversations have too typically been dominated by those white stories. So what would it mean to fundamentally recenter? Not just, again, this one spot in the curriculum, but recenter the way we think about childhood, to put a character like Newt at the center of it, to recenter community, to put this Oklahoma world of African-American and white community individually and together at the center of the story. What would it mean to recenter history, to think about histories of lynching, of the threat of rape from privileged white men against women of color, of all of the different histories that a book like this helps include, as well as all the others that are in no way limited, of course, to any particular time or any particular community. What would it mean to recenter those fundamental questions that we so often experience through cultural works, in classes, and then in our broader lives? From a text like To Kill a Mockingbird to a text like The Learning Tree. from an artist like Harper Lee to an artist like Gordon Parks, from a character like Scout to a character like Newt, from this one story to another. It is not simply a choice or an either or. To come back to that point, I'm all about addition whenever it's possible. But there are choices to be made. There are choices in classes, in curricula, in what is taught, in what is included or foregrounded or particularly emphasized. And then we can build upon them, I hope, in broader and ongoing ways. But when we make those choices, we still very often make them in ways that make To Kill a Mockingbird one of the most, if not the most taught and read texts in our schools and our conversations, and make the learning tree so completely forgotten in those conversations. And at the end of the day, that's about two things. One thing it's about is, again, reframing how we think about American culture and society. I like To Kill a Mockingbird a lot, and I think Harper Lee's a really interesting writer. But of these two figures, Gordon Parks was, by leaps and bounds, the more groundbreaking and influential across a huge range of artistic and cultural media and forms, across decades and decades of influential work from the 30s into the early 2000s. And the only reason why we don't think of him that way already is, again, the choices that we have made and what we have left out. And the need then, the vital need to expand, not just the stories that we read or tell, but our collective memories, our narratives of America, of our artists, of our cultural figures, of our history. And then finally, again, to come back to us, the ultimate work that does isn't simply about what gets added in, or it isn't simply about what happens in a classroom or what books or films show up in our lists or in our conversations. It's about how we define America. It's about how we define who we are. And so far, despite all the progress that in various ways has been made in terms of things like multicultural education and collective memory, I would argue and have argued in multiple settings that we still far too often have white as a default for what we mean by American identity. And then we might layer in other identities or communities on top of that. It's long past time that we did everything we could to shift that narrative, to make our default definition of America as truly multiple and as truly diverse as the nation has always been. And that doesn't start just with big proclamations. That starts with the choices we make in our classrooms, in our conversations, in what we read, what we view, what we highlight, and doing that with the learning tree in place of To Kill a Mockingbird a great deal of the time is an example, but an important example of how we can start to fundamentally shift what we mean by America and American stories. I'm going to end there. I'm going to briefly leave up this continuing conversations moment just to remind you that I would love to hear from you beyond this talk right now. By email is a great way to do that, but you can get me on the various socials or other online spaces as well, of course. Really love to keep the conversation going beyond. I apologize for all the technological stuff, but hopefully you got a sense of those threads that I wanted to bring out, particularly in terms of why to read and view the learning tree, but also what it can mean in our larger contexts as well. Going to presumably stop sharing and hopefully get to some thoughts and responses and questions and follow-up ideas from you all for a bit here. And I know there were some in chat. Yes, some of them about the experience of technology. And then, Ben Thompson highlighting, again, I don't want to overstate this too fully, but I think it's really important that in the learning tree, the story of rape is a story of this privileged young white man raping this young African-American woman, Arcella. That is such a defining American story and a difficult one, certainly for middle schoolers or high schoolers to have to deal with, but one that we need to deal with and that our texts can help us deal with.
Right. Because, as one of the key takeaways I got from my class at Dr. Cortesio at Semester Diversity Education is that even if you don't discriminate against it, people who are from marginalized communities, once they walk outside your classroom door, they're more likely dead. They often face it in their daily lives on a more regular basis than they'd be comfortable to admit.
Yeah, absolutely. That's well said. Thank you, Ben. And again, if we think about the work that texts can do in highlighting particular stories and in highlighting particular American experiences, I think the experience of multiple characters in Learning Tree are ones we still very much need in our conversations.
There was a Wikipedia article on the book Learning Tree. There's only one in the movie, which I was looking up in the background, which I thought was crazy.
Well, there's work to be done now. We need more editors to add those into the mix. Other folks' thoughts, other questions, responses, things you would add into this mix to keep this conversation going a bit? You can ask it in chat, you can raise your hand, or you can just unmute and ask. I see Kevin and Carol Smith have a hand. What are you all thinking?
Hi, Ben. This is Kevin.
Hey.
Do you think one of the reasons that so many books are from the white-based point of view is because 98% of the individuals in the U.S. don't know their own family story, as is evidenced by a program like Finding Your Roots, where they bring in, semi-famous persons and look at their history and their heritage, and they find that other than 1 or 2 generations back, even those people don't know what their history is and how their family was affected by racism or slaveholding or the country they came from. And even though people may be curious, it takes such an effort to go back and to look at what your real history and your family heritage is. So if you don't have that curiosity, you're not going to read books like The Living Tree versus Mockingbird.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think it's also kind of a vicious cycle, because then the choices that are made of what might be read or presented can kind of further those absences. And the other thing that I would say that I think is really important to what Kevin's highlighting is, and I used this word a few times in the talk, but maybe I didn't foreground it in the way that I would want to now, which is that there is a sort of mythology, right? Or a set of mythos that we individually often buy into about our own heritages or our own lives, and certainly that collectively as a society we buy into. And just an interesting example of that, even in the world of Mockingbird, as you all may know, a few years back, I think it was 2015, there was this very controversial publication of the book Go Set a Watchman, which is the other Harper Lee book. There was some talk that it was published sort of without her full consent, because she was toward the end of her life and may not have been entirely in charge of that choice. It was a text that apparently was written at least partly before Mockingbird, because it's set with an older Scout, and then Lee had made the choice to kind of revise Mockingbird to the younger version. But what was most controversial wasn't the publication of it or the different location of it. It was that in this other version of the story, the father figure, Atticus Finch, was significantly more fraught and even at times more racist than the kind of noble older lawyer that we meet in To Kill a Mockingbird. And in particular, we learned he had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan at a certain point in this other novel. And I think the reason why so many people were so upset about that has something to do with this idea of the mythos that we sort of need to believe. Atticus was this kind of noble ancestor figure. There were apparently numerous people who would name their sons after him. And so to see him complicated in that way was very difficult for a lot of people and felt like a violation of the myth of him. But in truth, I think what Kevin's getting at, and certainly what I would argue, is there's a great quote from the movie Glory that I like to highlight, and it's really about not just race or history, but America, which is ain't nobody clean. We're all in this conversation. We're all dirty in some ways. We're all part of the mix of history and identity. And those myths are often about cleanliness, about purity, about a separation of those histories. And so I think, the more we learn about that in our individual lives, but certainly in our collective lives as well, the better equipped that we'll be to challenge those myths for all of us. I agree with that.
And I think a big problem too is that because of racism in the past, it wasn't taught to us, so we don't know it exists. I think there's just a lack of general awareness of the book existing. As you know, as one of the others we talked about is like how, and the things we talk a lot about is that people like to see them, representation is very big, and people like to see it for themselves. But if the representation isn't there, then the interest in making sure the representation from the book isn't there. And also, I think part of the problem is when this book was written, I think that book, like The Giving Tree, didn't have as wide of an audience because there are a lot more people that are complacent with, or at least very least complacent with the Jim Crow South than we'd be comfortable admitting. And the whole ancestry thing is, the easiest way to find ancestry is to just give your DNA to somebody, which a lot of people aren't comfortable doing because for privacy reasons. So that's another thing too. People talk. There's the whole controversy whether or not to have slave reparations, whatever, and then people realize that like even our own vice president, she has slave holders in her ancestry. So we're way more interconnected and interrelated than people even realize.
We certainly are. Thank you, Ben. Other folks' thoughts? Yes, Stephen Pinkett, I see you.
You're on mute.
Unmute, Steve.
Yeah. My wife and I just watched the Learning Tree movie yesterday for the first time. And yes, I agree with you. It did create some positive aspects of, white people and black people living together. But one really negative thing that was negative across the board was law enforcement. Mm-hmm. Those guys were the typical white devils that the black people talked about. In my own life, we've had, my wife and I have had relationships with black people, maybe more so than most white people here in Massachusetts anyway. And so I know that we can live together. I just like to see more people develop those personal relationships, and you find out that they're just people just like we are.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate those thoughts. And the role in both the novel and the film, the role of the police in particular, the judge character is a very different perspective for sure. But the police, the law enforcement officers, I think is a particularly negative portrayal. And one thing that I would say that helps us open up, and that doesn't mean it's the only possible portrayal, but one thing it does help us open up that is kind of hinted at in To Kill a Mockingbird, but only kind of elusively hinted at is the challenge to one of the dominant narratives. One of the dominant narratives, even of something like lynching, as an experience of, say, the Jim Crow South throughout the century after the Civil War, is that it was lawless mobs. It was these mobs of sort of lawless, angry individuals. But in truth, the center of lynch mobs were very often some of the most prominent white folks in town, including law enforcement officers and people like judges and lawyers and ministers, and openly so. That's why Ida B. Wells could write about that when she covered lynching so fully, because these were individuals who didn't hide their role in things like the Klan.
Yeah. Yep.
And still talking. And so I think it's really worth thinking about that choice. And it is a choice, and it's a complicated choice, but it is a choice that reflects, at least, let's say, the way that world felt to a young African-American kid like New, right? That people such as these police officers were not just sort of negative forces, but were kind of aligned with the most dangerous parts of that society for them, right? The possibility at any time of something like lynching, like racial violence. So I think it's a really interesting element to note, and certainly one that plays into these larger histories, I would say.
Yeah, that Kirky character, he, how am I going to say this? He was complex in a way that at one moment he would treat the kids fairly, and then at the very next moment he might be shooting them in the back. Life to him was pretty cheap, obviously, especially black lives. Yeah, he shot 2 people in the back in the course of a 2-hour movie,
Yes, he did. And at the beginning and end, right? It's a really interesting framing device that Parks uses in the book and the movie, is these 2 very different. We know them very differently. We don't know the first guy at all. We know the second one really intimately without spoiling it for folks. But they are these framing moments, these 2 framing moments of exactly that, of a kind of easy, quick recourse to violence by a white law enforcement officer against these black men. And that is, again, part of the world of what that book and that movie add into the mix in really complicated ways. I see a question in chat from Kat. How books become part of the curricula. And that is a really interesting question, right? And one thing to say, just to be really clear, is it takes more than just individual teachers, right? Because, for example, books have to be in print, for them to be assigned usually, because you have to have a number of copies for your students, or at least access to it through digital versions now, none of which I think is necessarily true of the Learning Tree right now as a book. Not that I'm aware of, I would love to be wrong. And
No,
so,
I'm pretty sure you're correct. I don't think there's a digital version.
right. And I don't know that
Whether
there's
I
a,
even know.
right, she would. And I don't think there's a print version online either. I mean,
Wow,
if-
what?
in print version on that's available. It's out there, but used copies or older copies. So that's one step, right? One step for sure is the step of trying to help get works into the conversation, into circulation, into print, before teachers can even really consider adopting them, or at least consistently be able to do so. But then, I mean, the other thing that I would say, and this is not again about individual teachers, but it's about the way we approach curricula, is just this idea of, in my experience, what the default is versus what then is sort of layered onto the default. And if the default remains white works front and center, and then we're sort of layering on other possibilities as examples of kind of representation or diversity, that, for example, makes it so that there are always only going to be perhaps one or a couple works by authors of color in a given year or a given class, because there's only so much space. And so if that default were shifted to mean any of these stories, all of these stories, it would allow then the choice of so many more texts throughout a year, throughout a class, throughout a high school curriculum, throughout middle school, beyond maybe that one or couple kind of representative diverse voices, along with these default texts like To Kill a Mockingbird. So I do think that's another layer to the collective conversation as well. Martha, I see your hand.
Oh, I just I checked. Apparently, Amazon has it in paperback available.
Oh, okay, good. I'm glad to be wrong about that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, that then would be an answer to that first question, right? It should be able to be assigned. Then it wouldn't necessarily be easy because it's not typically being used in schools. And so the large quantities or availability might still be an issue to be dealt with. But that's one step, right? One step is simply sort of awareness and availability of authors and texts that we can all in one way or another be contributing to or helping make the case for. And then a second step is reframing the way we think about things like classes and curricula. And again, what is or is not at the center of that, to allow for more of these voices and texts to be included as well. The other folks' thoughts? Yeah, Ursula?
Yeah, I was just checking. It's also in, I'm in Shrewsbury. It's also in the Shrewsbury library system as an ebook.
Okay.
There was an ebook. That's good to know. I wasn't able. Okay, now I'm gonna have to go back and do some searching.
Well, who knows where or how we find these things, but yes, it seems like, again, then the third issue, the issue along with availability at all and recentering the conversations. The third issue is just in this obviously world of so much of everything all the time, so many texts, so many possibilities, is finding ways to raise awareness beyond what is the default. Because I think To Kill a Mockingbird is easy, right? It's there already. We all have a sense of it already. And yes, Wendy, my colleague Wendy in English Studies just raises a great point that To Kill a Mockingbird has an accusation of rape, but because it's already so established, it can sort of easily, again, be in the conversation. And the experience of rape, which is off page, we don't see the rape happen in the Learning Tree. We only hear about it after the fact, see it after the fact in the film, or learn about it after the fact. We never see it in any way. But nonetheless, yes, that might well be challenged in different ways than such an accepted kind of familiar canonical text as Mockingbird. But that really is the pivot here, right? Is what has become so familiar and canonical and accepted, and what is excluded as a result. And so that work would be fraught, I think, in a lot of ways, but would be really necessary, not just with this one pairing, but this larger work of pushing on those things that have become so familiar. And I think, again, to come back around to where I started, what makes Mockingbird so frustrating to me, the way that it's used, is that it is very often the text in a particular class or curriculum about issues of racism and prejudice and the justice system, because it is seen that way, because it's presented and read that way. And again, that's in there in a minor way, but that's not centrally what this book is, nor what it's even trying to be. And so I think it's not only just that it's a white author and a white-centered story and world, but then it's used as a way into themes of things like race and racism and injustice and prejudice that the text doesn't entirely support, that it can't bear the weight of sufficiently. And so doubly so in that case, I think the work of finding texts, whether it's Learning Tree or so many other possibilities, hopefully including in a central way voices of color and stories of color, artists and content, that can explore those themes at a greater length, a more multi-layered depth than what Mockingbird is able to do. So again, it's not even that To Kill a Mockingbird should never be taught, but the way that it's taught, the weight that is placed on it to do this work, I think is inaccurate to it and is really frustrating because of what then gets left out of that spot, that possibility within our curriculum and our classes as well. And then I saw there was another chat as well. Yeah, just a good thought from Andrew about, again, this idea of whitewashing, the whitewashing of history. And again, I mean, I think it's important to note, as Andrew does in his comment, that voices like Harriet Beecher Stowe's and Harper Lee's are important voices to think about including as well. It's not either or. And I think it is meaningful that these women, for example, wrote these texts that do represent other histories and cultural stories than simply the most mainstream or white supremacist ones. I think that is an important piece of it as well. And so that's why ideally I wouldn't want to see it as either or. I wouldn't want to see it as simply a replacement. But I think we are still so overdue for voices like Parks and texts like The Learning Tree becoming more central, becoming more essential to the way that we teach, the way that we learn and think about our history.
You know, it's not even just novels. There are lots of books talking about racism and how to solve it right now that are big bestsellers that are written by white authors.
Yep. Yes, there are. Yes, there are.
That's another layer to the story too. So, and you know, it seems to me that, like, when I think about it, the only texts that I remember reading in school that were direct first person had like major like novels about from races that from people that were directly marginalized were books about the Holocaust, which are great and definitely be part of it, like Night by Elie Wiesel, and Diary of Anne Frank, although that has some complicated questions you could actually ask about how that's taught too.
Mm-hmm.
And then the upstairs room is another interesting one, but like other than that, I think I actually read it to Kill Mockingbird on my own. It was actually not actually taught in my curriculum, which I think is kind of interesting.
It is. Thanks, Ben. And Wendy, continuing to remind us, just for folks to keep looking at the chat beyond this conversation as well. It'll be in the recording and beyond, but of some of the complexities of the work that the teachers are asked to do. And I guess if I'm going to end on one note, I know we're up against 6 o'clock here. I will note that the one thing I definitely don't want to be seen as doing here is critiquing the work that teachers are doing for lots of reasons, including just that's the opposite of what I would ever want to do in 2021 more than ever, but ever. And particularly secondary and middle school teachers, the work that they're doing now and that they always do. So my interest here is in much more of these collective approaches and conversations and reframing, rethinking all of our engagement with this, all of the work that we can all do is really the ultimate takeaway that I would want to emphasize here. This is not simply about what any individual teacher or school system should be doing. This is collectively about how we think about our stories and try to expand them and include that more genuinely diverse and multiple American story and voice and set of stories and voices that we need in front of us now more than ever. And Lori, I know we are up against 6 o'clock, so I don't want to.
We are. Thank you, everyone, for your engagement on this. I think this was a really interesting conversation. And thank you, Ben. I'm so glad we were able to pull this together. And thank you, everyone, for attending.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.